Hey, what's going on, everybody? So here's the M52 pulled out of the E36. Obviously, you saw that in the last video. There were some struggles with that thing coming out. Had to lower the steering rack and disconnect the steering column, or the steering shaft rather, just to get the oil pan clear coming out. Not a big deal because honestly, that lower steering coupler is pretty much trash, and I'm replacing the steering rack anyway. So here's the M52 and the ZF 5-speed. Obviously pretty greasy, pretty dirty, so the plan today is to get this whole thing separated, remove a lot of the components off the engine, including the manifold, all the accessory drive stuff, get rid of the AC compressor, strip the engine down a little bit. Going to get it up on the stand and degrease it, so you're taking along for that ride. Alright, our first step is going to be to remove the transmission, but before I get there, I'm actually just going to go ahead and release some of our shifter components. Right here is they call it a guide bearing bolt, and just slides in like that, and you can remove your whole shift lever support. Now this ball socket right here is completely destroyed. You saw that in the previous video. Probably end up reusing that shift lever support most likely, so there's nothing wrong with that per se. And we'll put that clip back in place. Now on our well, on the selector rod you have a little clip, this guy right here, that just you have to slide off, but apparently it just broke off. Then you can remove the selector rod, which that one is covered thoroughly in grease. And then we have our selector shaft or selector rod pivot pin, pivot bushing, a couple different names for it, but basically there's just a little dowel that comes in between here, and there's a circlip here on the surface, so you just pry back and just push the pin out, and the selector comes off, or the selector bushing comes off. Of course, if you have the proper pliers for this is actually really easy. I'm just going to destroy that snap ring because I don't plan on using this component at all. Trash at this point. There we go. Yeah, so like I said, it's just a little ball socket, but this thing is super worn, so that's going to be going in the trash. Alright, and now we can go ahead and start removing some of our bell housing bolts. These are all E12 and E14 bolts primarily. Two main mounting bolts on this engine, or I'm sorry, four. You have two up here, which are E14, and then you have two a little bit lower on the sides down here. Now these other bolts obviously mount the transmission to the block, but you know, a couple of them are hold the starter in place, and then there's some smaller ones that kind of hold. There's a shield behind here that holds that in place. They're not structural, I guess is the best way to put it. So start here on, this is a starter bolt. This is a E12. Your other starter bolt is down here, which is also an E12. So I'm going to pull the starter off first. Bolt. But fortunately, these don't get stuck in place. They don't get seized in place. But the starter is probably seized in place. There's a dowel right here. Does it work? Does it not work? Who knows? Makes me feel better. There's the starter. Now there's a couple of E12 bolts that go into the oil pan. We'll crack free a couple of our bigger guys here. These are the E14s. These are structural. They go into the engine block. And don't try to use anything other than an E14 socket. I'm not convinced like a universal spline drive or something like that is gonna work for this. Alright, next step, I'm going to go ahead and remove the pressure plate. These are all 6mm hex cap screws. One-time use only. Buy new ones, come pre-applied with Loctite. Don't bother using them. There's our dual mass flywheel. Save this and reuse it. Ugh. Yeah, we're gonna be doing new pilot bearing, all that stuff on this. So all these items are gonna be refreshed eventually anyway. Our next step, we're going to get the exhaust manifolds off. These are 11mm, and I suspect that we might break a couple of studs or round off a couple of nuts, but we'll see how that plays out. Okay, that was loose. Loose. Okay, they're all coming loose, which is kind of unexpected. Now, I did spray these down with some penetrant, but I can tell you for sure the penetrant is not the reason why these are coming off. Hey, listen, I'll take it. I've had some of these studs before where they just freaking break off instead. So, well, it looks like I'm not going to have a struggle here, but I'm just going to go ahead and remove all of that and then put the engine block drain plug back in the location. I did open it last night to drain the coolant out, which is just easier to do it while it's just sitting here, so no coolant left in the engine whatsoever. Just going to go ahead and remove these manifolds, and then we're going to go ahead and take that AC compressor off. Manifolds and the secondary air are off. Everything went smooth. There's just 3 studs that stayed behind, but I can get those later. Not worried now. Take the AC compressor off. It's held on by 4 13mm bolts. I'm not putting AC back in this car, so I'm not really even sure this compressor works. Bearing for the clutch sounds like shit, so it's not really worth giving to somebody else. Must be some kind of dowel holding this in place. Yep. 2 dowels. Look at this AC belt pulley. Not only did it literally borderline disintegrate, but the bearing in it is... Okay, I would have replaced that ASAP. There's an old saying, measure twice, cut once. Now, I didn't do any measuring of the length of the bolt. So in this case, I measured never and bought twice, and I was still wrong. So I've got M12 by 175 by 90 on the top, and then I actually just reused the longer M12 by 175 bell housing bolts at the bottom. Now that I actually know how long they need to be, I'll just go and get the right bolts this time, and I'll just have some M12s laying around for use at a later date. But and then this is the arrangement that I used for the stand adapter. Pretty straightforward. Everything kind of settled to where it wanted to be. I used some washers on the bolts. Bolts can thread all the way through, so it's not like it's a blind hole or anything. So even if you're not dead on, you should be fine. So yeah, that's it. And I'm going to use the stand to get the rest of the stuff off. And I'm going to clean the engine, and then put the engine on the dolly, and then move the dolly, or move the engine and everything inside. I've been actually pretty fortunate in this. The apartment that I live at, the unit next door, has been completely trashed by a previous tenant, so it's being completely done. The carpet's not salvageable, so I'm being allowed to do the engine work in there. I'm gonna put tarp on the ground, but yeah, I'm doing like kind of an engine room build. So like kind of every car guy's fantasy, I guess. So go ahead and get this on the stand and get busy taking the rest of the stuff off that I need to take off. All right, that is the engine pretty much completely disassembled. You know, obviously there's all the parts on the ground. I just took the valve cover off just to see what it looked like in there, and found a couple of pieces of sludge, but overall not terrible. I think a lot of that stuff with frequent oil changes moving forward, and the heat will eventually burn that stuff away. So at this point, I'm just going to put the valve cover back on it, get the engine off the stand, put it on a dolly, and then move it inside. You know, I cleaned up the engine as much as I realistically could with brake parts cleaner and some rag. But, you know, for the most part, a lot of the stuff's going to get cleaned up over time as I take off, like, the oil filter housing and take off the oil pan and things like that. So, you know, that'll get addressed as it gets addressed. But thank you for watching the video. Any questions, comments, leave it for me below. And see you for the next one.